Hi everyone, I'm Patricia Kaufman, Communications Director for the CLL Society, welcoming you to our COVID-19 Part 3 virtual community meeting, and we are communicating with you stronger than ever as we have transitioned our 30-plus support groups to online meetings and rescoped our patient educational forums into virtual community meetings such as this one. We are still there for you. We've listened to your requests for more Q&A time during these meetings, so no slides today, just our well-informed panel of experts answering your questions. Today, in addition to our moderator, Dr. Brian Kaufman, and lab scientist, Dr. Susan LeClaire, pharmacist Tom Henry, we welcome fresh faculty. Infectious disease specialist, Dr. Joshua Hill, who has a strong interest in vaccines, and cancer Dr. Mazyar Shadman from the Seattle Cancer Care Alliance, as well as City of Hope CLL expert, Dr. Alexei Danilov. We will be fielding a broad range of questions, but if you are confused because you are newly diagnosed, please sign up for our April 27th webinar titled, Just Diagnosed? What Do I Need to Know? When Drs. Neil Kay and Dr. Brian Kaufman will help you out with that. COVID-19 is an acute illness and a public health crisis, but it will pass. And the CLL Society will still be there for you, providing critical support and credible cutting-edge treatment information. It's my pleasure now to introduce a 15-year CLL survivor, Dr. Brian Kaufman.
Well, welcome everyone, please note that you will be muted during this, but there is an opportunity for you to type in your questions, and I see people are vigorously doing these, and I'm vigorously trying to compile them. The questions will be seen just by the staff and the speakers, and we'll try to get through them all. That's why we've kind of eliminated the slides and everything to try to help out here. The session is being recorded, and we've archived the first 2 sessions that we've done, and we plan to archive this one. I want to thank our sponsors, AbbVie and AstraZeneca, and I have to say that the industry has been very responsive to the changing in needs, and just like there's a rush in research, they've been able to shift and help us to put these things on, and we're very grateful for that support. Patty did the introduction, but I think many of you know me. I'm a retired family doctor, a CLL patient myself. At this point, I have no measurable CLL, thanks to CAR T therapy done 2 years ago, and Dr. Shadman was one of my doctors at the Fred Hutch Seattle Cancer Care Alliance. My longtime friend, Tom Henry, is a CLL survivor himself and was a chief pharmacy officer at Roswell and in Florida also. Susan LeClaire, Dr. LeClaire has a knack for explaining very difficult lab tech issues in a fun and kind of intuitive way, and takes very complicated concepts and makes them accessible, and will explain. And we'll be peppering her with some questions about the lab testing and things that are going on. So Tom was at Moffitt. That just slipped from my brain for a second. I'm sorry, Tom. Alexei Danilov was up in Portland until recently, and we're lucky in Southern California to have him here at City of Hope. He's a doctor scientist doing basic science research in CLL and also taking direct care of CLL patients. And Dr. Shadman, as I said, has been very involved in CLL and other lymphoma research, and has a great expertise in cellular kinds of therapies like CAR T, transplant, those kinds of things. Dr. Hill is an infectious disease specialist who works with Dr. Shadman up in Seattle, and his area of interest involves vaccines and also dealing with the immunodeficient, which would be us. So, and we're very glad to have an infectious disease specialist as part of our panel. So we've just run through the introduction. We're going to have the panel just say some opening comments if they wish to. Very briefly, there'll be we'll do a polling question, and there'll be polling questions at the end, but the whole bulk of the meeting will be Q&A. So what I'll have people do is kind of briefly say any introductory statements they want. Tom, do you want to start with that for us?
Sure. So I'm Tom Henry. I am a practicing pharmacist and a CLL patient, a member of the CLL Society's Medical Advisory Board and a clinical writer.
And how about Dr. LeClaire? Anything you want to say in introduction?
Well, I think many people have known me from the more static listservs and stuff and situations, but I too am a member of the CLL Medical Advisory Board, and I hope today to try and clean up some questions about testing and what is actually the situation across the country.
Dr. Daniloff?
Hi, Alexei Danilov. I'm a physician scientist focusing on lymphoma CLL at City of Hope National Medical Center in Los Angeles.
And Dr. Shadman?
Yeah, Maziar Shadman. It's great to be here. I'm a CLL lymphoma physician, and it's exciting to be here. I see 373 participants already, so looking forward to those questions and hope this is going to be a productive session for everybody.
Okay, and Dr. Hill?
Yes, hi, nice to meet everyone here. So my name is Josh Hill. I'm an infectious disease physician, and I really specialize my practice in patients with compromised immune systems, and particularly cancer patients, and do a lot of research and clinical work in this space. And I'm happy to have the opportunity to chat with some people today, and hope this is informative and helpful.
These are the pre-test questions, and I think there's 6 of them if I recall. So make sure you scroll through. I'll give you another 10 seconds or so to do these, because we'll look at them again, and then I think Brad is going to give us the answers. All right, so Brad, can we pull up the answers here? All right, so we see that most people have been at prior meetings, so we'll probably want to focus on newer questions and stuff for that. And it looks like what I'm seeing is an increased number of people compared to in the past who agree or strongly agree that they understand the precautions that they have here. There's a majority of people who understand about testing. The anxiety levels are extremely high, with agree and strongly agree at 87% of people, so that may be something. And this is interesting. What's the greatest fear? The greatest fear is becoming critically ill. It's good, I think, from the work that you've done in the past, Tom, is the fear of running out of medication seems to be much lower. The fear of shortages, but a significant number of people worry about this success on society. And then there's more of a spread here, isn't there, in terms of what people plan to do. The biggest number here is stay at home and let their family do the shopping and have necessities delivered. Followed by stay at home, except for essential work and shopping. But 1/4 of people will be going out shopping and stuff. So there's kind of a mix about who's leaving home and who isn't. So I think what I want to do is get to the questions so we can stay on time here. And Dr. Hill, I'm going to start you immediately and talk about this vaccines. And one of the questions, and it's kind of a series of questions we've had here, is do we know whether this is going to be a live vaccine or a kill vaccine? CLL patients generally advised not to have live vaccines. And then a follow-up question is, would it work for us? We're immunodeficient. We don't do that well with vaccines. So give us a sense of this and maybe the time frame, just in your own words and thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks for those questions. They're critical questions and obviously very relevant to the global population and particularly to cancer patients and CLL patients. And they're receiving a lot of coverage in the media. Also extremely challenging questions because we're still very early in the process and we aren't any closer really than we were a month ago to any answers here. I think there's over 60 different potential vaccines that are currently in different stages of development, anywhere from super early stages of production to testing in animals to testing in humans. So I have not seen any data yet on actual results from humans being vaccinated. Maybe others have seen some of those data coming out. It's almost impossible to keep up with the stream of data that are coming out and being updated in real time. And a lot of the data that have come out are not actually peer reviewed, meaning that they've been put up there, but they haven't been reviewed by the scientific community. And so we always like to approach findings like that with a grain of salt and cautiously until it's really gone through a more rigorous procedure. So to answer some of the specifics that I've seen some questions about is whether or not the vaccine will be live versus inactivated. So that's a good question. My understanding of the majority of vaccines that are being studied right now are inactivated vaccines for the most part. These are vaccines that are using parts of the genetic code of the virus or parts of the proteins of the virus that they make to basically be formulated into a vaccine product that can be given to stimulate someone's immune system to respond to the most, the parts of the virus that are most likely to cause issues once you're exposed. So my understanding is that they're all inactivated. There may be some live vaccines that people are exploring, but I'm unclear about that. Obviously, the concern with giving anyone a live vaccine is that there's the potential for that virus to replicate and cause severe disease. So we would certainly be very cautious about doing that. And most of our vaccines that we use are inactivated, but certainly there are live vaccines. There's an example of that for influenza that some kids and others can get a live vaccine into the nose, although we don't use that very frequently anymore. But my understanding is most of the efforts are looking at inactivated vaccines, which would be fine to give to both healthy and immunocompromised patients as well as cancer patients. So that's what I anticipate. The next question is, will it work for patients with CLL and for other immunocompromised patients? And that's a question that we don't know the answer to yet. We don't know if it'll work in healthy people yet either. Certainly there's lots of anticipation that we will find something that will work, and I anticipate eventually we will get there. Some vaccines do tend to be less immunogenic, meaning that they aren't able to generate as strong of a response in patients whose immune systems are either low because of their underlying cancer or because of the medications they receive. Some of these vaccines we don't have as many issues with, so CLL patients may respond just as well to certain vaccines that are very actively able to induce an immune response. Different components of different vaccines have different abilities to do that. We're learning more and more over the past years about how to generate vaccines that are stronger, that can induce immunity in healthy and patients, as well as patients whose immune systems may not be working perfectly. So, I think we still I have not seen any data on how some of these potential vaccines are working yet. They're mainly being studied right now in healthy volunteers. So I think, they're not studying them in cancer patients that I'm aware of yet. So I think we won't really know for a while how they work in patients with compromised immune systems. So yeah, that's an initial burst of responses. I think we can talk maybe next about a timeline, but maybe others may want to weigh in, or you may want to move on to other questions. Just let me know how you'd like to proceed.
Dr. Danoff, if I could ask you to expand on that, the whole kind of the immunity, well, not just the vaccines, but if somebody had COVID, do we expect CLL patients to be protected, or do we know these things? If you could just talk about that sort of immune process.
Right. So, well, let me expand on the vaccines a little bit first. So we do discuss often that patients with chronic lymphocytic leukemia do have suboptimal immune responses to vaccinations. And that is actually work, a lot of which was done in early 2000s when chemoimmunotherapy was the only way we treated CLL. And even at that time, it was already clear that patients who had chemoimmunotherapy, such as fludarabine or other agents, they responded less well to vaccines than previously untreated patients with CLL. So it really, besides the vaccine, the other factor there is the patient themselves. So those folks who haven't had chemoimmunotherapy, we expect will have better responses to vaccines in general. And that's been shown with pneumonia vaccine. The other interesting aspect of it, as we use, maintenance, or however you want to call it, chronic oral therapies with CLL, such as acalabrutinib, ibrutinib, how will those patients respond? Are we then going to be forced to interrupt treatment with BTK inhibitors, for example, and give the vaccine and then wait and see what happens? And the reality is we really don't have the answer. But I would actually like to turn your attention to something which Adrian Wiesner's groups from the NIH presented at latest ASH, where they actually evaluated responses of patients on ibrutinib who received Shingrix vaccine while on ibrutinib. And interesting, what they found is that, as you know, this is an inactivated vaccine against herpes zoster. So what they have found is that after 2 doses, there seems to be a 5-fold increase in immunity against zoster. So even while patients were on ibrutinib, they actually were able to mount some immune response. Well, of course, so there was no comparison with healthy individuals. So we don't know if this 5-fold increase is same or different than in matched, age in healthy people who are of the same age. But at least I would say it's optimistic data that those patients can mount some immune responses, even when you're using an agent which clearly does have some immune inhibitory effect. In terms of how and whether patients with CLL will respond in terms of generating immunity following a COVID infection, this is, as far as I'm aware, this is really data-free area. The only data that I have seen so far was published in one of the top medical journals, I believe it was Nature, where humoral response or immune response of patients who sustained COVID infection was evaluated, and all patients developed antibodies, meaning immune response to COVID within 7 to 14 days. We don't have much information who those patients were. I believe they were coming from China. Interestingly, though, they also will continue to shed virus despite the presence of neutralizing antibodies. So we know that immunity is there. Maybe Dr. Hill could clarify whether there is any knowledge in terms of how protective that immunity is. We know that those are neutralizing antibodies in our preclinical and Petri dish assays. But in terms of how protective they are, I don't know how much information is there. I believe there is not much, and certainly not in patients with CLL.
Dr. Hill, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything there. I think that was a great summary. And yeah, I think most, and if not almost all of the data that we've seen with these sort of specific immune monitoring assays has been in non-cancer patients, aside from maybe a case report here or there. So we really can't make many conclusions about how the findings in other patients will play out in cancer patients. So I think those data are probably going to come soon and are highly anticipated. But yeah, most of what we'll be discussing today is what we know in patients that don't have cancer. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And then whether or not the antibodies that we're seeing are protective, I think the general sense here is that, yeah, they'll likely be protective. I mean, that's what our immune systems are doing. There are reports that you see of patients getting reinfected, or it's not totally clear if they recovered and then just had a worsening, or whether or not they're getting reinfected. That's just a numbers game. I mean, nothing's fully protective. We never say 100% in medicine. You can get, chicken pox and then seemingly get it again. So that happens in the best of cases, but everything that we know about other respiratory viruses would lead us to suspect that, yeah, the majority of the time, once you get this, you're going to get antibodies that should be protective in the majority of people for now, until the virus potentially changes or mutates, and that can happen, years down the road, like we see with influenza. And I think on average, most adults get reinfected with that influenza every 5 to 7 years. And that's just the reality of viruses like this that cause these types of infections.
Dr. LeClaire, could you talk a little bit about and explain the difference between the antigen test and the antibody test, just so people understand, and give us the status of where those two tests are at right now?
I'll try. That's not as easy as it sometimes sounds. The original test that most people heard about in the early stages of this experience of ours was basically a test for the actual organism itself. We'll skip the techno stuff on it and say that what we really were looking for in the 5.5 or so hours it took to run that test, we were looking for pieces of the organism, so that when you said someone was positive, you could say with a pretty good sense of confidence that they did indeed have this virus. So this is a test for now, for the present. Do you have this? The antibody tests are, as was previously mentioned, something that is a later on test. You have to first get the virus, make a legitimate immune response to it to such a degree that I can test for the presence of that antibody, that immune response. Now that's going to take minimum 2 weeks, maybe longer in different people at different stages, but it's going to take a while. So that test answers the question, were you ever exposed to? Do you have an immune response to COVID-19? So it's a question that's addressing the future in the sense, or it's addressing what happened to you a month ago or 2 months ago. One of the things we don't know is how long do these antibodies that you produce stay around in a large enough number for us to be able to pick up on this antibody test. But that's what the antibody test is doing. Did you have, as opposed to the original test, do you now have? That's kind of the easier way to think about those two kinds of tests.
And Dr. Sinclair, just to follow up there, I assume there's no data on how accurate this test will be for CLL patients. Or do we know whether we're going to form antibodies? And if any of the hematologists want to jump in on that, will this test be as accurate in a CLL patient as it is in an immunocompetent patient?
Anybody want to try for a Nobel Prize in medicine to answer that one? Because I'm not going to. I mean, we don't know.
Or Dr. Shadman, do you have any sense of what our immune response will be to this?
Well, I guess the answer is we don't know. I mean, we're at the very early phase of this, and so what we expect, I think Dr. Danilov explained that. I mean, we deal with another layer of basically complexity, and that's the type of treatment that some of our patients are receiving. So you have CLL, and then you have treatment that's directed to CLL. And what's different now is that instead of giving chemotherapy for a short period of time and then watching these patients, they are on ongoing treatment with different agents. So I think that's another factor that we have to look at. So to answer that question in future, not only we need to have data on like how these antibodies are helpful in general population, then you have to look at a CLL population who's not being treated. Then you also need to look at CLL patients on active treatment, and then even look more closer at different type of treatment. So we have a long way to go, and I think we are we're preparing ourselves to look at those questions, but I think the answer right now is we don't know.
And so what I'm hearing too, which is a question that's come up a lot, Dr. Shadman, is does it matter if you're watch and wait? Does it matter if you have undetectable MRD? Does it matter if are you in better shape if you're on ibrutinib versus venetoclax? Do you have any sense of this? I know the answer is we don't know, but I'm wondering if there's any experience in this yet.
Right. So again, the answer is we don't know, but then what we can think or what we can guess based on what we know from maybe other viral infections and vaccines is the following. So when we look at the data for CLL patients who were on, let's say, ibrutinib therapy, and there are small studies that looked at their response to, let's say, the flu vaccine, for example. And when I say small studies, we're looking at studies with less than 20 patients from different groups. Dr. Danilov gave the example for Shingrix, but even for flu vaccine, we have reports that show that our patients can actually have a good immune response to the influenza vaccine, for example. But then we have other studies, smaller studies that show that that response is not what we expect when you compare that to patients with CLL who are not on ibrutinib. Now, there may be signals on the dose of vaccine that the different groups use in those studies. And I guess my point is that I don't think I won't be surprised if we do see a response in patients who are on active treatment, especially with BTK inhibitors. We do have at least some reports from the NIH group and others that you may be able to see that response. Venetoclax is much less known about venetoclax, and we hopefully in our institution, we're working with our ID group, and we have looked at the response to the flu vaccine in patients who are taking venetoclax. We're hoping to be able to present that in future meetings, but right now there's really no data. I mean, the venetoclax effect on the immune system is much less known about it. So, and I don't know of any data in terms of vaccine response. I don't know if Alexi or others know anything, but that's more questionable. But we will get hopefully some information about flu vaccine first, and then hopefully in future we'll have more on coronavirus.
Tom, you did a good job based on the numbers that have come down significantly in terms of concerns about the supply chain. And I know you stay on top of that. Is there any update? And let me specifically address first just the supply chain issues, because there's been a buzz. There was a big Forbes article that, the BTKIs, specifically acalabrutinib and ibrutinib, might be able to help the COVID population. And I got a ton of emails and questions about, will that affect my ability as a CLL patient to get these meds? So could you give us your sense of what's happening there?
Sure. So as I've done for each of these presentations, I did go to the FDA drug shortage web page. And, I'm pleased to report that of the 11 drugs that I looked at are the most commonly used in CLL. They're currently showing no shortages in those drugs at present. And we've had some concerns about IVIG, and that may be the most vulnerable product. We, experienced significant shortages in that product last year. That's a product that we don't have the ability to influence as CLL patients because we can't donate blood, but our friends and our family that are capable should continue to donate blood, because it does play an important role in our care. And so IVIG is derived from blood that's donated by people all around the country and all around the world. The thing I think to keep in mind is with the two BTKI inhibitors, a bottle of 90 ibrutinib capsules treats a CLL patient for 30 days. That same bottle of 90 ibrutinib tablets would probably treat 8, 9, 10 patients, with COVID. I also don't think, given the high cost of the BTKIs compared to some of the alternative therapies, such as, the azithromycin and the hydroxychloroquine, that it's going to be a highly utilized option for the clinicians. And I would hope that if we started to see any pressure on those drugs, that the investigational use would be temporarily suspended so that we could preserve that drug for the patients that are currently being treated.
Yeah, and I think the point is too, if it does work, and I would say the only place to be looking at that would be in a clinical trial, and there are clinical trials that are looking at this. This is not something you want to try at home on your own.
Correct.
But if it does work, you're looking at 10 days, 14 days of somebody taking the medication versus taking it for years if it's helpful to the patient. So I think it's going to have a very minimal impact. And right now it's only being used in clinical trials. So that's a minuscule drain on the supply. And I understand that most of the manufacturers have very significant stockpiles of these medications in the US and aren't dependent, and at least in the short to midterm of, getting this stuff from China and stuff. And the supply lines are still open, the commercial airlines. You want to address that for a sec, Tom?
Sure. So, we've heard about commercial, airline passenger traffic, being cut by 95%. But, many of the airlines are continuing to fly cargo. Some of the passenger-only airplanes are now being utilized to move, critical supplies with no passengers on board, just a crew. The CEO of FedEx several weeks ago announced that they had significantly up the number of flights that they had going to China to pick up critical supplies. So I think that's, you know, at this point, I don't see any pressure down the road, possibly with IVIG, which is so critical for so many of our patients because we are, you know, in many cases prone to a higher rate of infections than the general population.
So I'm going to switch to another topic, and that's office visits and clinical trials. I'd like the hematologists to both jump in on this. Are clinical trials still enrolling on your institutions? And how, for people who are in a trial, how much telemedicine are you doing? Are you kind of softening up the demands? If you could talk about that. Why don't we start with you, Dr. Danilo?
Yeah, so at City of Hope, we have not stopped enrollment in clinical trials. There are certainly pressures in terms of research team availability, as you know, hospitals also try to contain the situation and limit the number of staff who show up to work at the same time and, you know, work in shifts. So that creates a certain pressure as well. But overall, we have not stopped enrolling in clinical trials. Our team has become a bit more selective in terms of, you know, we discuss a bit more in depth whether a patient should not go on a clinical trial and how much benefit will be derived. We have paused some first-in-human trials. However, if we feel clearly that the trial will benefit the patient and there are no good standard of care options, we do go for it. So we continue to put quite a few patients on clinical trials at City of Hope. Luckily, we so far have been lucky in terms of COVID cases at the City of Hope. So our clinics are operational, but certainly at a very reduced rate, so to speak. But yeah, with clinical trials, some of those patients end up coming into the clinic. We do use telemedicine as well.
And Dr. Shadman, maybe you can comment on your institution, and also if you could kind of spread it out and give a sense, because I know you've been in touch with a number of colleagues across the country, and, you know, not just at your institution, but at other big CLL centers. Do you get a sense from your colleagues what they're doing in terms of their clinical trials?
Right. So, I mean, our approach may have been a little bit different, mainly because Seattle, when this pandemic started, we were one of the hotspots. So what we did with kind of reviewed all the protocols, and for the ones that we thought that there's a very reasonable option for the patient to receive treatment as a standard treatment, we closed those studies. For example, a first-line study for CLL, of course, we hope to get patients on a time-limited therapy, and we have combination studies, but at the same time, we know they do well on one of the novel agents. So the frontline studies, for example, we stopped enrolling in those studies. But as Dr. Danilov mentioned, if we feel that a patient doesn't have another good therapeutic option, those studies are open, and even phase 1 studies we are enrolling. There are some studies that are on hold from the sponsor, like for example, some of the CAR-T studies that are kind of pharmaceutical sponsored, and the company, for example, decided to put the study on hold internationally. Of course, those studies are not enrolling. But when we talk about the clinical trials, there's another group of people that we're trying to protect, the research staff. And for example, if we have a study that involves a lot of infusions, which requires a lot of clinical support from the research team, those were some of the other considerations that we had to think about. But in general, I would say we've only stopped enrolling in studies that we are confident that we can provide a very reasonable treatment to our patients. So talking to colleagues, I think we see a range of basically approach from, I would say, I don't know of any institution that has put a hold on all clinical trials. It's more of a selective approach, or you basically keep the studies open and you go case by case, and physicians make a decision on whether or not it's in patient's best interest to go on a clinical trial. Remember, treating a patient on a clinical trial requires more clinic visits and things that are not otherwise done in a clinical practice. For example, number of tests, number of visits. And I think the general approach and the goal here is to minimize our patients' exposure to the outside world. So if you can achieve that by offering a standard treatment, that's our goal. Now, as things change, we're looking at these internal guidelines, and we'll be more open to having patients in studies.
Tom, would you be comfortable sharing your personal experience, because you have been in you're being followed and you shifted over to telehealth? Can you share that?
Sure. So I actually had my first telehealth visit yesterday, and I'm in a unique situation in that recently I've been on ibrutinib. It was this month 4 years, and having read a lot of the data of what's going on with the combination therapy with venetoclax, I spoke to Javier Pania, my CLL specialist, and said, did he think that was something that I would benefit from? And he says, well, in all likelihood, your insurance won't cover it. And so we submitted, and I'm retired military, so I have TRICARE, and they approved venetoclax. So I am now on week 4 of the full dose. Had a little blip in my uric acid level, which kind of indicates maybe some tumor lysis syndrome, last week's labs. And so he put me back on allopurinol. So we did a follow-up yesterday on that. The uric acid level was back down to normal, but I found it to be really good for that type of visit where you're just going over labs. How do you feel? Those kinds of stuff. It wasn't necessary to have any, real physical. I've been fortunate. I've never had palpable lymph nodes, or, my spleen has never been enlarged. So, that's not a real critical part of an examination of me, because that's just not been a factor for me. So it worked out really, really well. Total time involved, from start to finish was like 10 to 15 minutes. And to be honest with you, because he and I used to be colleagues, we shot the breeze for about 5 of those 15 minutes. So how are things at the hospital? Do they have any COVID patients there? Those kinds of things. So all in all, I thought it was thorough. I thought it was great. And just a couple of little hiccups technically, and we resolved that by doing the audio by phone rather than by using the computer.
Dr. LeClaire, I'm going to throw one at you that I didn't prep you on, but do you have advice? I mean, for some patients are very comfortable with the technology to get on a Zoom or FaceTime or Skype. They've been doing it with their grandkids or whatnot, and others aren't. Any advice is there? Because clearly a lot more is happening, not just with this, but I'm a family doc, retired family doc. My colleagues are doing most of their routine follow-up visits by phone now or by telehealth. Do you have any advice for somebody who maybe is not that technologically savvy in terms of what they can do and get more comfortable with this? There's a number of questions about this.
Well, I think the first thing that they can do is just take a couple of deep breaths. There's a lot of people who are doing this that have never done it before. So the first thing is you're not alone. There is a good possibility that your physician is not all that comfortable doing this as well. So both of you have to figure out what you're doing as you do it. And if you don't have the equipment, let's take the worst case scenario, you have a phone. Pick up the phone when it's your appointment time and say to your physician the truth. I don't have any equipment. Can we do this over the phone? And while there'll be some adjustment to the questions or how things are phrased, and it may take a little while longer because you have to go through the ums and the ers as you go through it, the two of you will work it out. If you have the equipment, and there are glitches in it, as there will be for all of us, then accept the fact that this too is going to happen, laugh about it, figure out a way, and just take a deep breath. I think everybody expects, or they have this overwhelming thought that everybody who uses this for the very first time should be as comfortable in front of a camera and using a microphone as some Oscar-winning movie star. That's not true. All you have to do is say, I've never done this before. Could you hang on for a minute because I have to think about this? Do you want me to shut the window? Whatever it happens to be, because I'm pretty sure if you ask each one of these physicians right now, would they rather have somebody who stumbles a bit but tries to tell them the complete answer than somebody who can be very suave on a computer and is trying to outwit them with not answering the questions completely or correctly? They would definitely vote for the person who sits there and says, I've never done this before. Can you help me?
Dr. Daniloff or Shadman, I know you've done some telehealth now. Is there any advice you would give to your patients? We can start with you, Dr. Daniloff, when you're transitioning to this.
Yeah, so I think telehealth is really has a niche. I don't think it will supplant personal visits. I hope it won't, because there is some information you simply cannot get on telehealth. But I'd say that a lot of what we do can actually be done by telehealth. Some of the second opinions, when a lot of what we do is reviewing records and essentially rendering a sometimes fairly theoretical opinion, which is relevant to a concrete patient situation. So my advice is to not be afraid of it and to realize that 95% of the time you actually may be getting the same bang for your buck. Use your resources, try to prepare if you can before you go online. As Dr. Leclerc has said, it's true, many people haven't done it. Some of my colleague physicians have never done it and are doing it quite well right now. So it's certainly a completely different skill, which many of us are not used to. But as this goes along, I think 6 or 12 months from now, it's going to become very natural to do this. It's just we need to get used to it.
Dr. Hill, you said you're doing some of your ID consults, telehealth. Any tips for patients?
Yeah, I think it's, as we already heard, it can be challenging to set this up and as far as the scheduling, and it's not always clear. So we've had a few bumbles where patients didn't know that there was miscommunication between the teams and it didn't work out. And ultimately, I think what we heard earlier was great that, we just picked up the phone at that point and just had a phone conversation. And, frankly, from my perspective as the physician, I could care less about the billing aspects of this. I know that is a real concern in some settings. We don't have to worry about that as much at an academic center, but those are bigger, structural concerns that I know the administration is trying to deal with, reimbursing these visits appropriately and making that more available right now. We just want to touch base with patients, whether it's visually is always preferred, but if it's by the phone, just to hear you and talk with you about what's going on and figure out the next best steps, that's totally appropriate and encouraged as well. So, I've got no concerns about that. There's something lost in a telehealth visit as far as the connection that you have with each other and the ability to explore other issues that might arise or do the physical exam. But I think for a lot of what we need to do right now for the critical issues to keep everyone safe, I think telehealth is appropriate in most contexts unless there's an urgent need. So, I totally support it in light of what's happening right now, unless there's a specific need to come in person. And I think everyone just has to do the best with the evolving situation, and things will get better as technology improves and everyone has better access to technology and understanding how these things work. But, that'll be a work in progress. But whatever way you can connect, I just encourage you to do that.
Dr. Shadman, did you want to add anything to that?
Just to echo what Dr. Lepre mentioned, I mean, this is a common problem for some of us too. I mean, just yesterday, one of my colleagues called me on my cell phone because he had some issues getting his camera working and Zoom, for example. I mean, and we fixed it. And remember, we are in a national emergency, right? So we can do things. We can pick up the phone and talk to the patients. And I've done it many times. If, for example, one of my patients wasn't able to unmute the iPad, and these things happen, and we just make it work. You just make a phone call, you get the information you need. And what we do, we have different levels of really. When we look at our patient list for the upcoming weeks, for example, we may decide that a patient doesn't even need to be seen now. We just postpone it for 2 months or a month. Some other patients, I just need to look at the blood counts, and we do that in a local lab. Some patients need to come here, for example. So, I mean, there are a range of actions that we do that are different than what we do normally, but I don't think we should, or patients should be worried about the technical aspects of it at all. I mean, the point is for a physician to have a conversation and a communication with the patient, and that will happen. So just wanted to mention that.
I'm going to get into some difficult questions here for the physicians. And I know that there's going to be a temptation to say we don't have data, but you're talking to colleagues, you have a sense of this. So let me run through some difficult questions here, and I'll start with you, Dr. Shadman. Do you have any sense if the CLL patients have two different vulnerabilities? One, are we more likely, I've asked this question at every session, and the answer is shifting a little bit. Do we have more vulnerability in terms of getting COVID-19? Are we more at risk for actually catching it? And I'm interested in anyone who wants to have input on that. And second, if we do get it, do we have a higher risk of serious illness and even a higher mortality risk with it? And I'm going to ask you not just to say, we don't know. I want you to ask what your gut tells you, what your colleagues in Italy and Spain and other people that I know you're in touch with tell you.
Well, I have to start with we don't know and we don't know, but then I get your point. So basically, we have to assume that our patients are high risk for both, unless it's proven otherwise when we get data, right? So we know that, for example, our patients are considered to be immunodeficient or having a less strong immune system compared to the general public. So we have to assume that they are at higher risk of contracting the infection. When you also look at the complications from COVID-19, we hear about patients with higher age or with comorbidities. And remember, the age of diagnosis for CLL is median 68 to 70, and it's not uncommon for our patients to have medical comorbidities. Now we can talk about the type of medical issues that our patients have versus the ones that are known to be affecting the COVID-19 outcomes, which are mainly cardiopulmonary issues. And but in my opinion, the way I see it, I have to assume that patients are at high risk of getting the infection, and I have to assume that they are at a higher risk of having a more complicated course. But we may learn later that it's not true. And again, I go back to the other comment. I mean, there are other layers there, like what treatments they're getting. Remember, our patients, and talking to some colleagues in Europe, for example, one interesting observation was that for stem cell transplant patients, I mean, those patients are considered really high risk, no matter how you look at it. And this is not, this is just a conversation and anecdote, right? But I don't think people are seeing that extremely high rate of infections or complications in that population. We'll wait for the data, but maybe because those patients are being more careful, maybe our cancer patients are just are used to follow the recommendations more strictly, and compared to somebody who doesn't have the history of that medical condition, they're staying home, they're following all the recommendations. So again, I hope that a year from now we learn that, oh well, maybe actually that rate of infection is not higher, and maybe complications are not that common, but we have to assume that they are, and we just hope that we're proven wrong.
Dr. Daniloff, any data or anything you know or anything you've seen in terms of treating CLL patients with COVID?
Well, no, I don't really have any data, and as I mentioned, we at our side we have been pretty lucky so far, maybe because of California's early restrictions on movement. I completely agree with Dr. Shadman that I also assume that our patients are at high risk for complications and possibly bad outcomes of COVID. It is already a very, very contagious virus on par with measles. So I don't know that our patients are at high risk of getting it because everybody is already at such high risk of getting it. It's probably not possible to be at high risk. But in terms of complications, for sure, and I would think that would be true. And based on what we know about flu and shingles and pneumonias. And again, that would be very individual if patients have not been exposed to any treatment before or a prolonged immune suppression from treatment, they'll probably be at lower risk compared with those who did that exposure. But as of now, there is very little guidance in terms of whether we need to manage those patients differently. One question would be IVIG and potentially fighting secondary infections using IVIG in patients who present with COVID. As you said, it's really data-free area. And we don't know patients out there who might have contracted COVID and recovered just like from any other viral illness. We just have no idea. There may be quite a few folks like that out there as well.
So let me ask Dr. Hill a tough question here that's I've gotten all kinds of variations on, and I'm frustrated because we're not going to get to some great questions here. But one is, we've heard stories in Italy, we've heard stories in other places that there's triage going on. And if you're a cancer patient, and I've had CLL colleagues talk with me saying they're having to fight to make sure their patients are getting the care that they want. You're having to make these difficult decisions in the hospital. You only have with limited resources. Give us a sense of what's going on there, how that affects the CLL patient in terms of the decisions. Are you much more likely to give that ICU bed to a healthy 30-year-old than a 75-year-old CLL patient with a comorbidity? And what's really happening? Tough question. I'm sorry, Dr. Hill.
Yeah, no, that's an extremely challenging question, and probably the most challenging question that any of us are having to even wrap our heads around or think about, and something that was really unthinkable to people practicing medicine, at least in resource-rich areas like we're all used to. And it's one of those questions that you just never want to have to deal with, or never, you would never think we would have to in this day and age. I think before we think about it too much from a doomsday perspective, I think what the key here to think about is how we're going to prevent that from happening. And I think that's already, well in motion here. And the reality is, despite Seattle being a hot spot and being one of the centers of the epidemic, the projections that we had 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago said, yeah, we're going to have this surge to the point that we are not going to be able to offer a ventilator to everyone that needs it, and ICU level of care, and the level of care that we are used to providing for all of our patients. But the light at the end of that tunnel is that we've come and gone past that point where we thought that would happen. And because of the proactive measures that we put into place, that was never a decision that any of us ever had to make. And really that's been because of the physical distancing that we've been doing and all the other proactive measures that we've been taking, that has not been a decision that we've had to address here. We know that our colleagues in Italy were not so fortunate, and in China as well, I think to some degree, but we're ahead of that curve now. We've seen and learned from the lessons of others. And we're in a place now where we're sending ventilators to New York City so that they're not having to answer or address these issues either. And, as healthcare professionals, we are by nature cooperative, and we really want to supersede any sort of regulatory bodies to make sure that we do the best that we can for all of our patients. So we are being very proactive in redistributing patients to different hospitals that have higher or less burden. So the University of Washington Medical Center in Seattle has been offloading some of the surrounding community hospitals. When their ICUs get full, we're accepting patients here. So we're doing our best as a medical community to make sure that no place is overwhelmed or overloaded, so that we ultimately don't have to address those questions. And I think the status of where we're at now in the US and hopefully in other countries around the world is going to avoid the majority of these issues coming up. So I think that's where I would approach this right now.
Let me just follow up with you on, there's a number of questions on treatment, and I know that there's a lot of stuff being shoved out that is not peer reviewed, hasn't been scientifically researched, but let me just throw a couple things at you, and if we can kind of get sort of a quick answer to those. Convalescent serum can you explain what that is? There seems to be some excitement about that. Got a lot of questions on that.
Yeah, totally. It's something that's, unproven for COVID-19. It's had efficacy in other disease processes, and we can talk a little bit about it. So convalescent serum or convalescent plasma, basically all that we're talking about there is taking blood. This is very similar to IVIG, to the concept of IVIG, which I think most of the patients that are on this call are probably familiar with. And so, if we were to, and I think I've seen questions about IVIG and is that helpful in patients with COVID-19?
Yeah, and if you want to address it, that'd be great. Yeah.
Yeah, I think these really go hand in hand together. So, IVIG is basically a product. It's an antibody product. So this is, a pooled plasma product from probably 1,000 individuals. When you go and you donate blood or donate plasma, labs can basically pull out the antibodies that naturally are circulating in that. And when you pool it from about 1,000 people, you get this good, representation from the population of what different, infections are circulating that people have been exposed to. You get this antibody infusion and you can give it to someone to give them protection to a lot of different infections that their immune system may not be making good antibodies to. So what's out there right now for IVIG probably wouldn't be helpful for our patients with COVID-19 for two big reasons. A, because, the IVIG that's made out there right now is from people that had not yet been exposed to COVID-19, so they don't have antibodies for this virus. And B, the unfortunate reality is that in other respiratory viral infections that we've studied in our cancer patients, IVIG typically does not seem to be that helpful, and there's a variety of different reasons for that. So the convalescent plasma concept is now getting specifically to the patients that we know were infected with COVID-19, have recovered, have hopefully generated that protective antibody response, getting plasma from those patients, concentrating it down to get the COVID-19 specific antibodies, and then giving that as treatment to patients that are affected. So, that's the idea. This is what, was done 100 years ago before we had antibiotics and antivirals for other types of infections. So there's lots of examples from, the medical literature, the medical history of using this before we had available vaccines or other specific medications. So that's the concept. Whether or not this convalescent plasma approach, so just taking what other people have made after recovering from infection and giving that, will be sufficient versus needing to really concentrate that in some way, which we use for other types of infections, sometimes a really concentrated, highly active concoction. There's hope that that will help. It's unclear that that's going to be the perfect solution. The next step of that is really genetically engineering and making synthetic antibodies that we know are supercharged to the specific areas that we need to target on the virus, and giving those as it's a biologic agent is what we call it. It's a type of medical therapy that's synthetic, but we build it based on what we've learned from the human antibody response. And that can be sometimes a more effective approach. We have a handful of those that are approved for medical use for RSV, respiratory syncytial virus is another respiratory virus that can cause severe infection. So we've got some experience and evidence that that does work from other contexts, and a track record for getting FDA approval to make those commercially available. But yeah, that's the basic concept and kind of where we are. There's a lot of these convalescent plasma protocols that are popping up, by institutions. We have one here at the University of Washington, and we're asking for healthy volunteers to come in who have recovered to donate. And we're getting an overwhelming response from volunteers come and do that. So that's really a great sign of our community showing up to make these products available for people that need them. But scalability is tough. we're not going to have enough to treat everyone that we need to. And that's why we need something that we can manufacture synthetically that will hopefully be more potent and that we can disseminate.
So we have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to kind of do some sort of a lightning round of questions here, and I'm going to stay with you, Dr. Hill, because there was a bunch of stuff that we haven't got to, and I know, again, these are, if they may not be data barren, but they're very little data. You know, the plural of anecdotes is not data, but hydroxychloroquine, the anti-malarias, that's certainly gotten a lot of buzz. What are the ID professionals, the infectious disease specialists, thinking about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think your comment here is critical, that, you know, the plural of anecdotes does not equal data, and really that's where we are with hydroxychloroquine right now. But even beyond that, we're starting to get some, you know, more robust data that have undergone peer review that are not quite so promising as we would have, you know, ideally liked, although we had some suspicion that it wouldn't be the magic bullet that we wanted. So, you know, there are a lot of different clinical trials that are ongoing, and those are really where we need to be putting our attention. These drugs are not, they're not benign. These are, you know, any drug is not benign for that matter, but, you know, Plaquenil or hydroxychloroquine is not a benign drug. We've seen serious, you know, side effects of this in patients with COVID-19, and that in the combination with azithromycin is particularly concerning, and we are nowhere near to a point of saying that we should routinely be doing this. We have had some protocols for treating patients with this in Seattle, and we're doing it. Whether or not it's helping is not clear. So now we're looking at more early on prophylactic approaches. So if someone's been exposed or they're in a high-risk context, can we give it to prevent the risk that they go on to develop COVID-19? So we've got experience doing that with influenza, for instance. If there's an outbreak in a senior living facility, sometimes we'll give people Tamiflu or oseltamivir to prevent the risk that they go on to get flu, and that has some efficacy, and we know that that works, but that's a direct antiviral agent that works on flu. So we're studying that for hydroxychloroquine. You know, in patients that are in the hospital and sick, it does not appear, based on what's coming out, to be that effective. And that's kind of where we are with it right now, but lots of studies still.
And I know there's a bunch of others, but the Gilead drug that's gotten a lot of buzz lately, can you just comment on your sense of the science and where we're at with that?
Yeah, so again, lots of, you know, ongoing work. There was a big article that made a big splash, I think yesterday, maybe from Slate, where there was some, you know, information that was leaked, or I haven't read the details yet, from the University of Chicago about their experience using remdesivir, and that it was highly encouraging data. And my understanding of that is that that was from an uncontrolled study. So again, just treating patients with it and then describing how they do, but not comparing it to similar patients that weren't getting it to see if they did the same or better or worse. So I think we still don't have data on how well that works and if it works at all until we see a controlled study come out. So we're using it, or we did use it as part of a clinical trial, which is already fully enrolled. So we don't have access to it anymore right now. You know, I suspect in the next month or two, we'll start seeing, or maybe even sooner, we'll start seeing some data from a properly controlled study where we can make conclusions. But, you know, we're hopeful that it'll help. We're waiting on the data, but there's still nothing that I've seen that indicates that it works.
And I'm going to switch gears here and ask Dr. Sinclair if she could give us really like kind of a 1 or 2 minute kind of overview of what precautions a CLL patient should be taking now, and when do you see us being reintegrated? You can handle all this in 2 minutes. Reintegrated into the community, because some of the guidelines are saying, you know, we're going to wait till phase 3 before the vulnerable are allowed to get out of the house. And that, who knows when phase 3 is going to be. So can you give us your sense of that?
I should put on the old Johnny Carson Swami hat for these. I think the answer is you should look at yourself and your life and make a lot of these decisions. Are you living in a large apartment building? Would make some of your decisions different than if you were living in your own home in a, I don't know, on a 2-acre lot. Because the chances of you becoming in close connection with someone who might have the organism is much greater in the apartment building than it is in the single home. I don't think any of us want to come out of this saying, well, I did all this stuff and it didn't work, because if it didn't work, you wouldn't be coming out of this as easily. You want to make choices that fit your lifestyle. You're going to wear a mask or some other kind of protective entities when you go to the grocery store if you can't get somebody else to deliver it for you. You're going to take those considerations when you go out for a walk if you live in a big city. You might want to not bother with a mask if, again, you live on a 2-acre lot and you're walking around the perimeter of your property is your exercise for the day, because the chances are you're not going to meet somebody. But I would rather err on the side of being a little silly and overcompensating than undercompensating. And as for how long this is going to take, I know yesterday I snuck out of the house for a little while and took a ride, because you do get a little cabin fever over time. But if you're going to cheat wisely. Take the ride in the car and stay in the car. Don't go someplace and then get out and mix and mingle with people. Do all of the things that you know your physician would tell you to do when he or she has that look on his face that means he's not really sure you're going to follow it. You want to err this time on the side of caution. And however long this takes, maybe if we all obeyed the rules in the first place, it wouldn't take that long. So if we can get everybody to do the social distancing, if you can get everybody to wash their hands and do those simple things, we might be able to get through this sooner. And so, no, I don't think I'm going to my professional meeting this summer, even though they haven't canceled it. And they keep saying that they're hoping there's going to be some kind of a change. I'm not booking that travel. It's just not worth it.
I'm gonna thank you, Susan. I'm gonna run through a couple questions really fast, and then I'm gonna have people kind of do a quick synopsis here. Can CLL patients donate blood? No, we cannot donate blood. There's been a lot of thought that maybe CLL might be an advantage because we have a modulated immune response, and maybe that's helpful, that we don't get the cytokine release syndrome, cytokine storm. It's an interesting theoretical thought. There's absolutely no data at this point to support this. In terms of routine scans and things like that, I think you have to have a conversation with your hematologist or oncologist. A lot of them are postponing them. Obviously, if there are new symptoms or new things going on, then you need it. But if it's just kind of, it's time for your scan and there's no, other than the routine kind of reasons to do that, I think people can hold off on that. One for Tom, and he can jump in if I'm wrong here, but they added venetoclax to your ibrutinib, not a switch to ibrutinib. Am I right on that, Tom?
Yes, I'm on both.
Yeah, and I think we've talked about, I think when telehealth would not be appropriate, I think telehealth is not appropriate if you're running a fever. Telehealth is not going to be, in most cases, if you're a CLL patient, is not if you've got new significant symptoms, if there's a change in your status, then telehealth is not going to be appropriate. Let's do the questions and answers. If we could do the post quiz here. So I think, wow, so still that same kind of response there. You still got one person who's neutral about the drug supply. And I don't think these numbers have changed that much. Let's look at the anxiety numbers, and they're, people are still anxious, so greatest fear, I think, is still the illness fear. That's still a big issue. And I think these are I think these are roughly the same as they were before. I think more people are staying at home now and having groceries delivered than before. So maybe I can ask people to do a quick kind of summary on this. I know that there was a million questions that we got to, and we might have spent more time on one thing than you wanted and the others. And we'll see about scheduling another one of these to try to address them, or maybe breaking them into specific topics, because there's so many things coming in so rapidly, it's kind of hard always. But Tom, any final words or anything that you wanted to say as both a patient and a pharmacist?
Well, sure. So, you know, I mean, this for many people is a very scary time, and I think it's measured by the anxiety that we see. I think that, you know, we just need to bear in mind that, you know, we are a team, a community that is a team that shares information, and I hope that, you know, continuing to do these webinars will help to alleviate some of that anxiety. You know, when we talk about the immune system, I think one of the big factors that compromises our immune system is a high level of stress or anxiety. So let's try to control that and improve our immune system.
Dr. Shadman?
So I had a call from one of my patients the other day, and I thought it would be a good time to address that question. A patient called me, and looking at the news, basically, nothing really scientifically reported, the news about maybe the potential benefit of ibrutinib or acalabrutinib for this situation. This is a patient who doesn't need to be in treatment, but he was asking to kind of start ibrutinib for that reason. You know, I just want to make sure that we all understand that these days we see a lot coming. And just to give you an example, what came out about acalabrutinib the other day was simply a press release by the company, I believe. And you know, there is in theory a benefit of a drug like ibrutinib or acalabrutinib in suppressing part of the immune system that may be responsible to create an immune storm in response to the virus, and that may or may not be true. But there are other parts of the immune system that all will be affected by a drug like ibrutinib or acalabrutinib that can overall actually could be more harmful for a patient with COVID-19. When you look at the infection course, there are different phases of this infection. There is an initial phase of the virus coming and starting the fight, and the later cases, the patients who get very sick, they have an immune response to the virus, and sometimes that immune response gets out of hand. So you have to be very careful that we wait until there's a clear clinical data in favor of using these agents for the setting of COVID-19 before we really start changing our treatments or asking for those changes based on really these random reports that come out of different institutions, especially like not even institutions, different like websites or things like a press release. So I just wanted to mention that as a CLL community, we are of course aware of those theories, and there are studies that are ongoing right now using these agents in this setting. But until we get the clear answer clinically, we have to be very careful and stick with the principles, and we're not going to change any treatment strategies based on those reports.
Dr. Hill, any final words or advice you'd want to give to your immunodeficient patients out there?
Yeah, well, again, thanks everyone for tuning into this. And clearly, I think you're doing the right thing by trying to get these sorts of resources and take advantage of them to educate yourselves about this. And I think I just want to certainly reiterate what Dr. Shadman just said. I think those are really key sage points to really hold on to and take to heart. The other point that I just wanted to reiterate that came up earlier was that overall in our cancer community here in Seattle, in our cancer patient population, we've been seeing a lower burden of infections than we are in the general population. And not because our patients are at lower risk, we really do think that they're at higher risk, but because I think, patients with CLL and with other types of cancer already walk the walk and talk the talk and know what they're doing as far as preventing themselves from getting exposed and from getting infections. So I think when this, as the initial phases of this were rolling through our communities, our patients who are on active chemotherapies are already being careful about avoiding big public spaces. They're already, isolating if they're ill, and they're already doing good hand hygiene. These are the foundations of keeping yourself safe. And I think that's why we haven't had outbreaks at the SCCA. I mean, we're already, as physicians and providers and, you know, healthcare personnel, we're already doing all those extra screening steps. And if someone's got respiratory symptoms, we isolate patients and we put on precautions. So both from the medical infrastructure side of it, when our patients are coming in to see us, we already have those safety measures in place that really aren't that different, frankly, now than what we're doing now compared to what we were doing in the past. So we've already been doing what we should be on our side to protect our patients. And I think our patients have already been doing what they should to protect themselves. So I think that's the one reassuring thing that I'd throw out there, and I encourage people to continue doing that.
Dr. Daniloff?
Yeah, you know, I think it's very difficult to not be anxious, actually, whether you have CLL or whether you don't have CLL. I don't know about you guys, but I have never lived through a pandemic before. So I see everybody is anxious. So that's completely normal. But because of, you know, I completely agree with Drs. Shadman and Hill. There is a lot of reasons to be optimistic. And I think we just use common sense, and our patients should just use common sense. Use telehealth when they can, limit their forays outside of the house, you know, follow the general advice, the general precautions, which, as Dr. Hill said, many of them have already followed, actually. So, I think we'll get over this and block out some of the negative and untested information, a barrage of which is coming at us. I completely agree with Dr. Shadman. A lot of what comes our way right now is completely untested and will need to be verified in rigorous research needed before we do anything. So, so that we don't harm. I'll stay optimistic and say that we'll be able to come out of this.
Dr. Sinclair, you have the last word.
I am going to modify it a little so that those of you who have been to these things before will hear a little bit of a change. But to kind of summarize everything, if you are looking for science information, listen to NIH and CDC if you live in the United States, and listen to the World Health Organization and your country's ministers of health. Do not listen to your neighbor's ex-girlfriend. They're probably stupid. And they're just telling you things that are coming up willy-nilly from all over anywhere. If you want to make a good decision, get good facts. If you want to know about your community, how many cases are there in your community? What is your state or your city or town doing about it? Listen to your governor or to your mayor or selectman or whoever is in charge there. They will tell you what is going on that is important for you to know. Again, your neighbor's friend, unless that happens to be the mayor, probably isn't going to have the quality of information that the officials in that area are going to get. This disease is cropping up in what CDC calls popcorns. You get all of a sudden one city and then another city and then another town. It's not spreading equally over time. So learning what Seattle might be doing today might be nice if you live in Seattle and the greater Seattle area, but it's not going to help you decide whether or not the town you live in is doing something. The third thing is, there's only one group of people who know about you to the level that they can give you medical advice, and that is your healthcare team. They probably know you down to the genome by now. So if you have questions about your health, ask the people who know about your health. Ask them what to do. They have gotten a new advantage that we didn't have 4 or 5 weeks, well, maybe we did, but maybe 3 months ago. We didn't know what to do with this epidemic or how it was going to act. Was it going to act like the swine flu? Was it going to act like SARS? Was it going to act like AIDS? Nobody knew. Now, one of the benefits of having survived the saddening experience of watching China and Italy deal with things is that we now have ways of coping. No physician that I have ever met in my life wants to say and will ever say willingly, oh yeah, let those people die because they're old. Every old person, and I'm one of them, is always afraid. Well, you get to be an age, your grandchildren think you should just be, you know, tossed away somewhere, and you worry about it. No physician I have ever met has ever once in their life thought of that. Put that fear away and work with your physicians for tomorrow and the day after and the day after. And finally, you are in charge. 3/4 of this anxiety is because you feel you're not in charge. You are the one who decides whether or not to wash your hands after you read the paper. You are the one who decides whether or not you're going to go out and walk in the mall parking lot where everybody else is gathering. You're the one who decides whether or not you want to hug and kiss 17 relatives. You are in charge of your life. So make those decisions. Wash your hands, stay away from people, and breathe deeply, knowing that you now have a healthcare team in the United States that has learned from everybody else's experience. We can do this. End of speech.
Thank you. Thank you to the entire faculty. I just want to say us CLL patients are the experts in chronic disease. We have a disease that gives us time to become experts, and all the CLL docs I talk to talk about their CLL patients being kind of sophisticated, knowing what's going on, because we're not pressured to make a decision in the first week like an acute leukemia, where they have to make a decision sometimes within days, you know, to get their best possible care. So we should be the leaders in leading people out of this acute illness, because we already know so much more about how to handle being ill, how to protect our immunity, what's going on. So I'm very grateful to our faculty. I want to thank our sponsors again, AbbVie and AstraZeneca. And again, I've got to say, while there's been this rush to put all this information out, and the World Health Organization is publishing stuff so fast, we were extraordinarily pleased that there was a rush to support these kinds of things. And, you know, some of the researchers that I've talked to have said that things might take months, you know, in the past to change the way the protocol for a clinical trial was. Sometimes they can get those answers in hours now. And the pharmaceutical companies have supported our efforts in this area within days instead of months. So we're very grateful for that. Do we have another slide, or is that it? Yeah, thank you for attending. And just a couple things. April 28th, when all of this is over, we are hopefully will only have our CLL to worry about. So we have a session on everything kind of not related to treatment on April 28th with Dr. Neil Kay, and out of the Mayo Clinic. Neil is a great educator, and we'll be constantly updating our COVID page with new information. I thank you for being proactive. You know, our motto is smart patients get smart care, and I hope you left this hour and almost an hour and a half here a little bit smarter about what's going on. Again, thanks to our faculty, thanks for everybody who attended, and thanks for my team in the background that I think pulled this off without too many, with no technical glitches. So everyone stay home, stay safe. I like to say we're all in this together, but at this time we're all in this together 6 feet apart. So I hope everybody is doing well, and feel free to reach out to us at support@cllsociety.org, or to me personally, B. Kaufman at CLL Society. And thanks again to everyone.